So, as I spoke in the previous video, that there were confederations of native tribes here in the U.S., and that these confederations came about in a lot of different ways. One of the confederations that ended up causing problems for the tribes that were native to the region that we now know as Illinois was the Iroquois Confederation. Now, this was a group of 5 tribes and later 6 after another tribe joined up with them that were in the eastern part of the United States. Okay, and these were the Mohawk, the Seneca, the Oneida, the Onondaga, and the Cayuga. Okay, the Tuscarora joined up with them later on. So these were like in the area that's now Pennsylvania originally. They had hunting grounds over there, they had territories. The Seneca were the biggest, and then the Mohawk were the tribe that was furthest to the east. Now, the tradition, like the oral tradition that the natives passed down as to how this confederation came about, was that they were all initially tribes that were at war with each other, but that hundreds of years before before Europeans got there, there was a man named Hiawatha, and there was another guy that they just referred to as the Great Peacemaker, who came together and decided to draw up kind of like a constitution, like a law of peace for these tribes to abide by and get along with. And when they drew this thing up together, this actually eventually became part of the basis for what would influence Ben Franklin. And there's a lot of similarities in it to the American Constitution. So this was kind of an interesting, it wasn't really like a document, but it was just like a set of laws that they came up with. And again, that's the tradition. The exact time period about when Hiawatha and the Peacemaker, whatever his real name was, came together is speculated. Some think that it was like in 1100 AD. Something think that it was as late as 1500 AD. But it was before Europeans came to that region at any rate. What they decided was that it was going to be a matrilineal society. So they were going to decide lineage based on the mom, and that women were going to have like a leadership role, I wouldn't say like a total leadership role, but like an equal role in leadership in the society. So there was going to be things called clan mothers, and these were going to be like authority figures in families and in the longhouses that they inhabited, with multiple clans and everything coming together to then form these councils that they would have. And the chiefs were actually decided and could be removed by these women, these clan mothers that had this authority. So it was interesting. They gave women a lot of authority. If you look at the way that they operated in these councils, it was almost like a democratic republic, because they had chiefs that represented the individual tribes, the individual clans, and there was different numbers of chiefs for each tribe, and they would come together at these councils, and then they would kind of have a set process by which they would deliberate and make decisions. One group would arrive at a certain decision, then they'd pass it on to another group, then they'd pass it on to another group, and it was a very organized, structured manner of deciding everything. Okay, and it was really kind of like a democracy. I wouldn't say a total democracy like the one that we have today, but it was definitely a very democratic process, much more than you had in a lot of societies that were monarchies, okay, at the time. So the Iroquois, just to fast forward a little bit before I kind of fill in the details, they eventually had come into the region that we now know as Illinois and almost completely obliterated part of the Illinois Confederacy and greatly reduced their numbers through warfare. But the Iroquois, eventually grew to be what some Europeans referred to as the Roman Empire of the Americas, okay, because they were so big and so strong, and they had so much wealth and so many crops, and the Europeans really just looked with awe upon what the Iroquois had been able to achieve. But the Iroquois made a fatal mistake that eventually brought about their demise. There were multiple groups of Europeans here, okay, that were not getting along. As you guys know, you had the French, you had the British, you had the Americans, and then you had the Spanish. You had a lot of different groups coming over here. So the Iroquois, they were kind of shrewd traders and business businessmen, and they were kind of playing the French and the British off of one another to try to get the best deals in trading. Okay, so they would kind of side with one side when it was in their interests, and then they would side with the other side, with the British or the French, depending on who was kind of in the position to benefit them the most, depending on the situation. And they were playing both sides. Okay, well, that wasn't too much of a problem until the Revolutionary War. Because in the Revolutionary War, they had to pick a side between the Americans and the British. And the Iroquois chose to side with the British in that war. As you guys know, as we all know, the British eventually lost the war. So after they lost the war, the British headed back to Europe in defeat. The Iroquois had been siding with the British, fighting alongside them. It was the British and the Iroquois versus the Americans. Well, now the British were gone, and the Americans retaliated with a vengeance on the Iroquois for what they had done in siding with their enemies. And they burned their crops, they raided them. The Iroquois, a lot of them fled to Canada, and some stayed here and kind of just did what they could to, get out the way and survive from the Americans, because now the Americans were done with them. It's like, you want to take our enemy side? Well, all right, then you're going to get it like they got it. And that was how they did them. So Iroquois was the name that the Europeans gave to their tribe. Their name for themselves was actually Haudenosaunee, which means people that live in longhouses. And today, there are about 45,000 of them that live in Canada, and there are about 80,000 of them that live in the United States. So that's as of 2010. So there's about, as of 10 years ago, about 125,000 people who are descendants of the Iroquois Confederacy. Okay, so why did the Iroquois, if they were from the Northeast, come into Illinois? Well, it had to do with trading. Okay, the fur market back then amongst the Europeans was really big. You got to remember, this is, 1600s, 1700s. It's cold outside. Ain't nobody got space heaters back then. You need something to keep you warm in the wintertime. This is the North Country. Furs were highly valuable for survival. Okay, this wasn't just about looking fly. It was about actually living. So the fur market was huge. Now, the market in the region that's now like Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, the Great Lakes was really big. Okay, now the different native tribes were taking sides with different Europeans. The Iroquois were on the side of the Dutch and the British. They were trading partners with them. Now, the tribes that lived in the Illinois region, the Algonquin-speaking Illinois Confederacy tribes and the Huron tribes, the Great Lakes tribes, I'll call them, they were on the side of the French, and the French were their trading partners. So the French, against the British and the Dutch, had these two groups of Native Americans on either one of their sides, also trading with them. The Europeans that were on the sides of these native groups were supplying them with weapons. The Iroquois were getting their arms from the Dutch and the British, and the Algonquins and the Hurons were getting, whatever help they were getting from the French. But the British and the Dutch were doing a better job getting rifles and useful weapons to the Iroquois than the other way around. So they came into this region and they basically just they wreaked havoc. Okay. Now eventually, after a lot of war, when they lost eventually to the French, really, they were making peace, and some of those tribes were able to return, but they had done such irreparable damage by coming in and clearing them out and taking over the region that was so lucrative as far as trading furs that a lot of those tribes couldn't recover. So the conflict with the French was really what brought about the defeat of the Iroquois ultimately. Now, the Oneida and the Onondaga tribes were actually getting along with the French, but the Mohawks were the ones calling the shots at that time, and because they were the strongest tribe in the Federation, and they did not like the French, it ended up being a problem, a conflict. So the Iroquois had driven a lot of the Illinois tribes They had driven the Shawnee, they had driven the Miami out of the territories around the Great Lakes and out of Illinois. But after they eventually got defeated, really by mainly the French, because of taking sides against them, they had to actually withdraw from a lot of that territory, and a lot of the refugee natives that had been driven out of this region were allowed to return. So they signed a peace treaty in 1701 with the French, and that lasted only for about 10 years, 20 years. But with the American Revolution, like I said later on, that was what really brought about it wasn't like a demise, because they're still around to today, but they were forced to give up a lot of the territory that they had. And this was in treaties that they were really, I mean, they were in a bad position to negotiate after they had just lost the war, taking the side of the British. So they had to sign a lot of treaties that gave up a lot of their land. And they went on to certain reservations that basically, it left them as a shadow of what they once were. You know what I'm saying? As far as like the vast empire that was conquering all these other tribes, no more.